Hello everybody, and how are you? Last time we finished Puck of Books Hill by Rudyard Kipling. We do have another book of his to read. Sorry, I'm just going to change this light a little bit for you so you can see me. There you go, that's a bit better. We do have another of his books to read, but we are not going to read that today. I've found that if we change to another book for a while and then come back to one by the same author, like a sequel, the newer story is appreciated more. It doesn't feel like, oh, here we go again. And we don't want that if we're reading. I mean, we want to enjoy the book that we're reading, don't we? So we have a new book today, and it's called, what's it called? I shall look it up. I've got it on my iPad. There you go. And it's gone and locked itself. It is called The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Ouida is a lady whose real name was Louisa de la Ramée. I think that's how you say it. And she was alive. She was born in 1839 and died in 1908. I'm just reading off the other screen, obviously. And she's most famous in this sort of context, for a book called A Dog of Flanders. So we're not reading that. We're reading The Nürnberg Stove. There you go. That's quite an old one. I'll just see if I can see when it was written. Hang on. The Nürnberg Stove. 1895. So that's not a new one, is it? And is it a book that you've heard of? I'm not sure. We shall carry on. I've actually got a picture of the cover of it up in the corner. I remembered to see if I could do that at the last minute. Sorry about that. Anyway, introductions for those of you who are new here. I'm Jev. I live in NZ, also known as New Zealand, and I read old-fashioned children's books for anyone who wants to listen to them. You don't have to be a child. Remember the fun that you used to have when you listened to bedtime stories and you used to wish that they would go on for longer, or that they were told during the day so you'd have time to think about things after you'd finished listening to the story? Well, that's what this is. I read old-fashioned children's stories. I save the recordings from here on Twitch and I put them up on YouTube so that you can look at them again some other time. And I gather them into playlists so you can actually start a playlist and listen all the way through, or come back to it and complete the story. So if you ever miss any of our readings, and we're right in the middle of a story that you want to hear about, you'll have to wait 2 weeks if you've been watching it on Twitch, but it will come up on YouTube and you will be able to complete the story. In case you're wondering what happens next, I'll give you the link. And there it is. So, without further ado, we shall start. This is not further ado, this is essential. Do you have your drink of water, or whatever it is you're drinking that will keep you from being dehydrated? Maybe something to snack on, and somewhere comfortable to sit, or even lie down. Under a tree if the weather's nice where you are and warm enough. Inside, cuddled up next to the radiator, the heater, or the fire, or anything like that, under your blankets. Wherever you feel like being when you want to sit and listen, or lie down and listen to a story. So, I shall carry on reading The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. And I have to get to the actual beginning of the story. Chapter 1. This one doesn't have chapter titles, it just has numbers. That's a change. Auguste lived in a little town called Hall. Hall is a favourite name for several towns in Austria and in Germany, but this one especial little hall in the upper Innthal. I don't know if these are real places or not, so you might want to actually write the names of the places down and look them up on some map somewhere, such as Google Maps. You can do that while you're listening and still be able to listen. But this one especial little hall in the upper Innthal is one of the most charming old world places that I know, and Auguste, for his part, did not know any other. It has the green meadows and the great mountains all about it, and the grey-green glacier-fed water rushes by it. There are parts of Austria that are very much like that. I've been to them. They're wonderful. I just feel so, ooh, and you feel like you could just sit there and soak it all in, drink in this atmosphere of the space that you're in. Anyway, I'll carry on reading. So this is about Hall, the town that he lives in. It has paved streets and enchanting little shops that have all latticed panes and iron gratings on them. It has a very grand old Gothic church that has the noblest blendings of light and shadow, and marble tombs of dead knights, and a look of infinite strength and repose, as a church should have. Then there is the Muntze Tower, black and white. I'm assuming I'm saying it right, Muntze, and if it's pronounced differently, please send me a note so I can check that out. But for now, I'm going to read it as Muntze. I think Muntze, yeah. I'm going to read it like that. Then there was the Muntze Tower, black and white, rising out of greenery and looking down on a long wooden bridge and the broad rapid river. And there is an old Schloss, which is like a fortified house, kind of like a castle or a manor house combined, but in the Germanic-speaking part of the world. Schloss. There is an old Schloss which has been made into a guardhouse with battlements and frescoes and heraldic devices in gold and colours, and a man-at-arms carved in stone standing life-size in his niche and bearing his date, 1530, so that's quite old. A little further on, but close at hand, is a cloister with beautiful marble columns and tombs and a colossal wood-carved Calvary. A wood-carved Calvary. Now you can look up what a Calvary is. It's not necessarily the hill that Jesus died on. It may be a representation of that, like at the side of a village road, a road coming into a village. I know a lot of places that have one of those. Maybe that's a Calvary. Look that one up too. And a colossal wood-carved Calvary, and beside that a small and very rich chapel. Indeed, so full is the little town of the undisturbed past that to walk in it is like opening a missal of the Middle Ages. A missal is a book of how to do the Mass. A missal is a Mass book. So it's what the different prayers are, what the different psalms are to read, all that sort of stuff. So that's a missal. It's like opening a missal of the Middle Ages, all emblazoned and illuminated with saints and warriors, and it is so clean and so still and so noble by reason of its monuments and its historic colour that I marvel much no one has ever cared to sing its praises. Like, we were wondering, where is this place? Anyway, the old pious, heroic life of an age at once more restful and more brave than ours still leaves its spirit there. And then there is the girdle of the mountains all round, and that alone means strength, peace, and majesty. In this little town a few years ago, August Strehla, Strehla, I'm going to say Strehla, lived with his people in the stone-paved irregular square where the grand church stands. He was a small boy of 9 years at the time, a chubby-faced little man with rosy cheeks, big hazel eyes, and clusters of curls the brown of ripe nuts. His mother was dead, his father was poor, and there were many mouths at home to feed. In this country, the winters are long and very cold. The whole land lies wrapped in snow for many months, and this night that he was trotting home, with a jug of beer in his numb red hands, was terribly cold and dreary. The good burghers of Hall had shut their double shutters, and the few lamps there were flickered dully behind their quaint old-fashioned iron casings. The mountains indeed were beautiful, all snow-white under the stars that are so big in frost. Hardly anyone was astir. A few good souls wending home from vespers, a tired post-boy who blew a shrill blast from his tasselled horn as he pulled up his sledge before a hostelry, and little August, hugging his jug of beer to his ragged sheepskin coat, were all who were abroad, for the snow fell heavily, and the good folks of Hall go early to their beds. He could not run, or he would have spilled the beer. He was half frozen and a little frightened, but he kept up his courage by saying over and over again to himself, "I shall soon be at home with dear Hirschvogel." Who's Hirschvogel? We'll read on and find out. Here's a picture, and I will try to get it put up on our Discord server so you can see it. There's a little boy. I'm sorry, I can't get it to focus. There's a little boy down a snowy street holding on to a big jug full of beer and in the dark trying to make his way home. He went on through the streets past the stone man-at-arms of the guardhouse. That's what that is in the corner. That there. Not that one. I touched the screen. Over here, in that corner, that's the man-at-arms, the stone one, that's life-size, in the guardhouse. He went on through the streets past the stone man-at-arms of the guardhouse, and so into the place where the great church was, and where near it stood his father Karl Streller's house, with a sculptured Bethlehem over the doorway, and the pilgrimage of the three kings painted on its wall. He had been sent on a long errand outside the gates in the afternoon, over the frozen fields and the broad white snow, and had been belated, and had thought he had heard the wolves behind him at every step, and had reached the town in a great state of terror, thankful with all his little panting heart to see the oil lamp burning under the first house shrine. But he had not forgotten to call for the beer. And he carried it carefully now, though his hands were so numb that he was afraid they would let the jug down every moment. The snow outlined in white every gable and cornice of the beautiful old wooden houses. The moonlight shone on the gilded signs, the lambs, the grapes, the eagles, and all the quaint devices that hung before the doors. Covered lamps burned before the nativities and the crucifixions painted on the walls or let into the woodwork. Here and there, where a shutter had not been closed, a ruddy firelight lit up a homely interior, with the noisy band of children clustered round the house mother and a big brown loaf, or some gossips spinning and listening to the cobbler's or the barber's story of a neighbour, while the oil wicks glimmered and the hearth logs blazed and the chestnuts sputtered in their iron roasting pot. Little August saw all these things as he saw everything with his two big bright eyes that had such curious lights and shadows in them. But he went heedfully on his way for the sake of the beer, which a single slip of the foot would make him spill. At his knock and call, the solid oak door, 4 centuries old, if one, flew open, and the boy darted in with his beer and shouted with all the force of mirthful lungs, "Oh, dear Hirschvogel, but for the thought of you, I should have died." It was a large, barren room into which he rushed with so much pleasure, and the bricks were bare and uneven. It had a walnut wood press, handsome and very old. I think that's like a linen press is a closed cupboard that has shelves in it for storing linen in. I'm not too sure what a wood press is. It might be a set of shelves or something like that for storing wood on. You can look it up. Go on. It had a walnut wood. Oh no, it's a cupboard with shelves in it. It's made out of walnut wood. Sorry, we'll try that one again. It had a walnut wood press, handsome and very old, a broad deal table, deal's another type of wood, I think, a broad deal table and several wooden stools for all its furniture, but at the top of the chamber, that's at the far end, sending out warmth and colour together as the lamp shed its rays upon it, was a tower of porcelain, burnished with all the hues of a king's peacock and a queen's jewels, and surmounted with armed figures and shields and flowers of heraldry and a great golden crown upon the highest summit of all. And that's the end of chapter 1. What do you think so far? It's a little bit intriguing. Why is a little boy of 7 years old running around in the dark, in the snow, clutching a great big jug of beer? And what are these errands that he's been off running out in the countryside, outside the town? How strange. I'm going to have a drink of water before I carry on. It's your opportunity to now. I'll quickly rush off to the loo if you need to. That's better. This is an interesting one. I haven't read any of Ouida's other stories, actually. I've heard of A Dog of Flanders. I've never read it. It's one of those, there's a certain era of books that often ends with, it's an uplifting book, but it often ends with a little bit of tragedy, and I tend to not be so keen on those. This one isn't, by the way. I would just say, this one I've pre-read for you, so that you're not stuck with a, I love that, but oh no, why did that happen at the end? Anyway, so that's not to spoil it for you. This is just to give you some hope as we read through the story. Because some of these stories, when they're written a long time ago, they were written, the ones that I read tend to be a little bit different from a lot of the books that were written in that era, in that they had a degree of realism or imagination, or written for the sheer fun of it, that was not common in the era that they were written. There's a whole range of books that were written that were quite preachy, written for children, but written to tell them to behave themselves, because otherwise horrible things might happen, as you read in this story about this imaginary person. Not a lot of fun. Not really my sort of story. I don't tend to read those ones for the fun of it repeatedly. I read them occasionally just to sort of see what they're like. Some of them have got some great storytelling in, but other ones it's just like, oh yeah, well, next story. So this one here, it's got a lovely little conclusion to it. It works well. So just in case you get worried when we're reading. And by the way, I'm just plugging in my charger. And as always, it tells me that this device is not recognised when I plug it in. I have no idea why. That's just the way it is. Anyway, let's just see if I can get this to show as... Yes, that's what I want. I'm turning my tablet around so it sits the other way. And I just wanted to have it so I didn't have one page and then the other page next to each other, because I mean, you've seen how I get lost when I'm reading and I have to try and find it. And if it's got 2 pages showing on the screen, it's like, well, that's twice as much potential to get lost. So I'm going to carry on reading now. We are reading The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. She was an English woman, born in the 1830s and died in the 1890s, was it? I can't remember. You remind me. Okay. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida, who's a lady who's famous for having written A Dog of Flanders. We are going to carry on with chapter 2. It was a stove of 1532. Okay. And on it were the letters HRH, for it was in every portion the handiwork of the great potter of Nürnberg, Augustin Hirschvogel, who put his mark thus, as all the world knows. The stove, no doubt, had stood in palaces and been made for princes, had warmed the crimson stockings of cardinals and the gold-broidered shoes of archduchesses, had glowed in presence chambers and lent its carbon to help kindle sharp brains in anxious councils of state. No one knew what it had seen or done or been fashioned for, but it was a right royal thing. His description of the top of it really says that, doesn't it? It was a right royal thing, yet perhaps it had never been more useful than it was now in this poor desolate room, sending down heat and comfort into the troop of children tumbled together on a wolf-skin at its feet, who received frozen August among them with loud shouts of joy. "Oh dear, Hirschvogel, I am so cold, said August. I've just turned it round again and I have to find it again. Kissing its gilded lion's claws. "Is father not in, Dorothea?" "No, dear, he is late." So Dorothea is his sister, obviously. I think. because we've heard that his mother is already dead. Dorothea was a girl of 17, dark-haired and serious, with a sweet, sad face, for she had had many cares laid on her shoulders, even whilst still a mere baby. So if she's 17, she's 10 years older than him. She was the eldest of the Strehla family, and there were 10 of them in all. That's one every year. She's 17, he's 7. Next to her there came Jan and Carl, otherwise known as Jan probably, and Carl and Otho, big lads gaining a little for their own living, and then came August, who went up in the summer to the high Alps with the farmers' cattle, but in winter could do nothing to fill. Oh, okay, so he's not the youngest. Sorry, not 10, one every year. Who went up in the summer to the high Alps with the farmers' cattle, but in winter could do nothing to fill his own little platter and pot. And then all the little ones, who could only open their mouths to be fed, like young birds, Albrecht and Hilda and Waldo and Christoph, and last of all, little 3-year-old Ermengilda, with eyes like forget-me-nots, whose birth had cost them the life of their mother. They were of that mixed race, half Austrian, half Italian, so common in the Tyrol. Some of the children were white and golden as lilies, others were brown and brilliant as fresh fallen chestnuts. The father was a good man, but weak and weary, with so many to find for, and so little to do it with. He worked at the salt furnaces, and by that gained a few florins. People said he would have worked better and kept his family more easily if he had not loved his pipe and a draught of ale too well. But this had only been said of him after his wife's death, when trouble and perplexity had begun to dull a brain never too vigorous, and to enfeeble further a character already too yielding. As it was, the wolf often bayed at the door of the Strehla household, without a wolf from the mountain coming down. Euphemism, the wolf baying at the door. We don't have a lot of food. Okay, carrying on. Without a wolf coming down. Dorothea was one of those maidens who almost work miracles, as far can their industry and care and intelligence make a home sweet and wholesome, and a single loaf seemed to swell into 20. The children were always clean and happy, and the table was seldom without its big pot of soup once a day. Still very poor they were, and Dorothea's heart ached with shame, for she knew that their father's debts were many for flour and meat and clothing. Of fuel to feed the big stove they had always enough without cost, for their mother's father was alive and sold wood and fir cones and coke, which is a type of coal, and never grudged them to his grandchildren, though he grumbled at Strella's improvidence and hapless, dreamy ways, at their father's not caring enough. Father says we are never to wait for him. We will have supper, now you have come home, dear, said Dorothea, who, however she might fret her soul in secret, as she knitted their hose and mended their shirts, socks, and mended their shirts, never let her anxieties cast a gloom on the children. Only to August did she speak a little sometimes, because he was so thoughtful and so tender of her always, and knew as well as she did that there were troubles about money, though these troubles were vague to them both, and the debtors were patient and kindly, being neighbours all in the old twisting streets between the guardhouse and the river. Supper was a huge bowl of soup, with big slices of brown bread swimming in it, and some onions bobbing up and down. The bowl was soon emptied by 10 wooden spoons, and then the 3 eldest boys slipped off to bed, being tired with their rough bodily labour in the snow all day, and Dorothea drew her spinning wheel by the stove and set it whirring, and the little ones got August down upon the old worn wolf skin and clamoured to him for a picture or a story, for August was the artist of the family. He had a piece of sorry, I'm just going to move my chair too, because I feel like I'm a little bit too far away from the microphone and the camera. He had a piece of planed deal, that means evened up, smooth and flat, planed. He had a piece of planed deal that his father had given him, and some sticks of charcoal, and he would draw 100 things he had seen in the day, sweeping each out with his elbow when the children had seen enough of it, and sketching another in its stead. Faces and dogs' heads and men in sledges and old women in their furs and pine trees and cocks and hens and all sorts of animals, and now and then, very reverently, a Madonna and child. It was all very rough, for there was no one to teach him anything, but it was all lifelike, and kept the whole troop of children shrieking with laughter or watching breathless with wide open, wondering, awed eyes. Sorry, itchy nose. I saw the cat before, but I didn't pick him up. I don't actually have an allergy to the cat. It's just he has very fine fur, and if it gets on you and stays there, it tickles, and you can't see it because it's so fine. Anyway, they were all so happy. What did they care for the snow outside? Their little bodies were warm and their hearts were merry. Even Dorothea, troubled about the bread of the morrow, laughed as she spun, and August, with all his soul in his work, and little rosy Ermengilda's cheek on his shoulder, glowing after his frozen afternoon, cried out loud, smiling, as he looked up at the stove that was shedding its heat down on them all. "Oh dear Hirschvogel, you are almost as great and good as the sun. No, you are greater and better, I think, because he goes away nobody knows where all these long, dark, cold hours, and does not care how people die for want of him. But you are always ready, just a little bit of wood to feed you, and you will make a summer for us all the winter through. A summer for us all the winter through." How lovely. The grand old stove seemed to smile through all its iridescent surface at the praises of the child. No doubt the stove, though it had known 3 centuries and more, had known but very little gratitude. It's true. It was one of those magnificent stoves in enamelled faience which so excited the jealousy of the other potters of Nürnberg that in a body they demanded all of the magistracy that Augustin Hirschvogel should be forbidden to make any more of them. They're so jealous. Not a good thing. The magistracy happily proving of a broader mind, and having no sympathy with the wish of the artisans to cripple their greater fellow. It was of great height and breadth, with all the majolica lustre, it's a type of finish, which Hirschvogel learned to give to his enamels when he was making love to the young Venetian girl whom he afterwards married. There was the statue of a king at each corner, modelled with as much force and splendour as his friend Albrecht Dürer could have given unto them on copperplate or canvas. Albrecht Dürer was a real artist, a real person who was an artist, and very, very good at drawing something that was so lifelike, but still a portrait or a drawing or an etching. So you knew it was not like a photograph because they didn't have photographs then, but incredibly well done. And so these 2 men were friends. The body of the stove itself was divided into panels, which had the ages of man painted on them in polychrome. That means lots of colours. The borders of the panels had roses and holly and laurel and other foliage, and German mottos in black letter of odd old world moralizing. Black letter is what we would call Gothic as a letter style. And German mottos in black letter of odd old world moralizing, such as the old Teutons and the Dutch after them loved to have on their chimney places and their drinking cups, their dishes and flagons. The whole was burnished with gilding in many parts, and was radiant everywhere with that brilliant colouring of which the Hirschvogel family, painters on glass and great in chemistry as they were all masters. The stove was a very grand thing, as I say. Possibly Hirschvogel had made it for some mighty lord of the Tyrol at that time when he was an imperial guest at Innsbruck, written here Innsbruck, and fashioned so many things for the Schloss Amras and beautiful Philippine Welser, the burgher's daughter, who gained an archduke's heart by her beauty and the right to wear his honours by her wit. Nothing was known of the stove at this latter day in Hall. The grandfather, Strella, who had been a master mason, had dug it up out of some ruins where he was building, and finding it without a floor, had taken it home and only thought it was worth finding because it was such a good one to burn as a fireplace. It's a closed ceramic fireplace. There is a line, if you're watching on Twitch, there's a line drawing up there which shows some men standing next to one of those ceramic fireplaces. And I would love to show you a picture, but I can't if you're on YouTube. But also I'd love to show you a picture of a glazed one, what they actually look like. They're quite stunning. So you don't have an exposed fire. It's inside this ceramic or porcelain or whatever it's made out of. Big container. It's huge. They're bigger than people are. And then you have the fire in the bottom, and it heats up all the ceramic surface, and then that radiates the heat out into the room. Anyway, but you know, all those big surfaces, ideal for decoration. So I'll carry on. And only thought it was worth finding because it was such a good one to burn for keeping a fire going. That was now 60 years past, and ever since then the stove had stood in the big, desolate, empty room, warming 3 generations of the Strella family, and having seen nothing prettier, perhaps, in all its many years, than the children tumbled now in a cluster, like gathered flowers at its feet. For the Strella family, born to nothing else, were all born with beauty, white or brown, and they were equally lovely to look upon, and when they went into the church to Mass, with their curling locks and their clasped hands, they stood under the grim statues like cherubs flown down off some fresco. I can imagine it. The description is very much like that. And that's the end of that chapter, but not of today's reading. It's not a particularly big book, and the chapters are quite short, which is a nice change. It's been a while since we've had short chapters. So I'm going to have a drink before we start the next chapter. And we can carry on after that. So what have you got going on at the moment? Anything particularly interesting? Are you listening to me while you are working or studying? Because I do have a few people who enjoy listening while they've got something else going on. Or are you sitting or lying or sleeping or whatever in some way where this is the focus of what you're doing? Doesn't actually matter. I'm just wondering, that's all. Sometimes it's quite nice to much as we enjoy imagining things that we're listening to, sometimes it's quite nice to imagine things for ourselves with no other starting point. Anyway, I'm ready. No, I'll have one more mouthful. Sorry about that. And then I'll carry on. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida, Chapter 3. Sorry, that's the squeak of my water bottle closing. Chapter 3. Tell us a story, August, they cried in chorus when they had seen charcoal pictures till they were tired. And August did as he did every night, pretty nearly, looked up at the stove and told them what he imagined of the many adventures and joys and sorrows of the human being who figured on the panels from his cradle to his grave, which is what the Ages of Man stories are, as they are pictures of different stages in the life of a person. To the children the stove was a household god. In summer they laid a mat of fresh moss all round it, and dressed it up with green boughs and the numberless beautiful wild flowers of the Tyrol country. In winter all their joys centred in it, and scampering home from school over the ice and snow, they were happy, knowing that they would soon be cracking nuts or roasting chestnuts in the broad ardent glow of its noble tower, which rose 8 feet high above them, with all its spires and pinnacles and crowns. I did say it was big. Once a travelling pedlar had told them that the letters on it meant Augustin Hirschvogel, and that Hirschvogel had been a great German potter and painter, like his father before him, in the art-sanctified city of Nürnberg, and had made many such stoves that were all miracles of beauty and of workmanship, putting all his heart and his soul and his faith into his labours as the men of those earlier ages did, and thinking but little of gold or praise. So that was a travelling pedlar who's obviously seen a lot more than just what they've seen in the town. An old trader, too, who sold curiosities not far from the church, had told August a little more about the brave family of Hirschvogel, whose houses can be seen in Nürnberg to this day, of the old Veit, the first of them, who painted the Gothic windows of St. Sebald, with the marriage of the Margravine of his sons, the marriage of the Margravine, of his sons and of his grandsons, potters, painters, engravers all, and the chief of them, great Augustin, the Luca della Robbia of the north. Obviously that's a famous artist. Look them up. Luca-Della-Robbia. Luca della Robbia of the north. And August's imagination, always quick, had made a living personage out of these few records, and saw Hirschvogel as though he were in the flesh, walking up and down the Maximilianstrasse in his visit to Innsbruck, and maturing beautiful things in his brain as he stood on the bridge and gazed out on the emerald green flood of the Inn, which is the river. Innsbruck. So the stove had got to be called Hirschvogel in the family, as if it were a living creature, and little August was very proud, because he had been named after that famous old dead German who had had the genius to make so glorious a thing. All the children loved the stove, but with August the love of it was a passion, and in his secret heart he used to say to himself, "When I am a man, I will make just such things too, and then I will set Hirschvogel in a beautiful room in a house that I will build myself in Innsbruck, just outside the gates where the chestnuts are, by the river. That is what I will do when I am a man." For August, a salt baker's son and a little cow-keeper when he was anything, was a dreamer of dreams, and when he was up upon the high Alps with his cattle, in the stillness, with the stillness and the sky around him, was quite certain that he would live for greater things than driving the herds up when the springtide came among the blue sea of gentians, that's a type of flower, or toiling down in the town with wood and timber as his father and grandfather did every day of their lives. He was a strong and healthy little fellow, fed on the free mountain air, and he was very happy and loved his family devotedly, and was as active as a squirrel and as playful as a hare. But he kept his thoughts to himself, and some of them went a very long way for a little boy who was only one among many, and to whom nobody had ever paid any attention except to teach him his letters and tell him to fear God. August in winter was only a little hungry schoolboy, trotting to be catechized, that's to be taught your catechism, by the priest, or to bring the loaves from the bakehouse, or to carry his father's boots to the cobbler, and in summer he was only one of hundreds of cowboys who drove the poor, half-blind, blinking, stumbling cattle, ringing their throat bells, out into the sweet intoxication of the sudden sunlight, and lived up with them in the heights, among the alpine roses, with only the clouds and the snow summits near. Now, I'm just going to go back to that to explain it. Who drove the poor, half-blind, blinking, stumbling cattle to the fields. In Europe, especially in the really cold places, your animals, your stock, are kept indoors so they stay alive, and they are put in barns. They are keeping each other warm because they're all together in this enclosed space, so they are much healthier than if they were left out on the snow, on the hills, on the mountains, where they wouldn't even be able to find food, even if they did manage to scrape through the snow, because the grass underneath has all completely died off with all the cold. So they're in the barns, they are fed hay and straw and maybe grain and things like that. And all of that sort of thing means that At the start of spring, when it's the right time to take them out, you take them out of these dark spaces because you're not going to put a lot of light in there for them. You might have a window that puts some light in there, but you're not going to put a flame in there because you have to keep tending a flame and putting fuel in it. And also it's a fire risk. So they come from being in a dark space into the sudden brightness of the spring sunlight. And it's a huge difference. It's like coming from being in a movie theatre to out in sudden daylight in the middle of the day. If you ever go to a movie in the middle of the day or in the morning and you come out and it's a sunny day afterwards, it's like, oh, this is really, really bright out here. That's what these cows are like, the cattle are like. Where we lived in England, they had wintering barns, and it was similar, except because they were not being led up to the hills. They were just out in the paddocks right next door. But you'd see them come out of the barns, and initially they were steers, so they were not cows, a little bit less docile. You'd see them come out of the barns onto the field, and initially they're just sort of walking along carefully, and then they're breathing in this fresh air from outside, and they've got the sunshine on them and this grass under their feet, and suddenly they start running and jumping and pushing each other around because they feel alive. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see it. It's totally different to anything we're used to in this part of New Zealand that I come from. It's a whole other world. Anyway, so that's the cows going up to the mountain fields and the summer mountain fields. He was always thinking for all that, and under his little sheepskin winter coat and his rough hempen summer shirt, his heart had much hair. Sorry, this is not, I'm trying to find where this sentence is going to put the emphasis in the right place. His heart had as much courage in it as Hoffa's ever had. There was a typo. It says and, but it's meant to be as. As much courage in it as Hoffa's ever had. Great Hoffa, who was a household word in all the Innthal, and whom August always reverently remembered when he went to the city of Innsbruck and ran out by the foaming watermill and under the wooded height of Berg Isel. August lay now in the warmth of the stove and told the children stories, his own little brown face glowing red with excitement at his imagination. As his imagination glowed to fever heat, that human being on the panels who was drawn there as a baby in the cradle, as a boy playing among flowers, as a lover sighing under a casement, that's a window frame, as a soldier in the midst of strife, as a father with children round him, as a weary old blind man on crutches, and lastly, as a ransomed soul raised up by angels, had always had the most intense interest for August, and he had made not one history for him, but 1,000. He seldom told them the same tale twice. He had never seen a storybook in his life. His primer and his mass book were all the volumes he had, but nature had given him fancy, and she is a good fairy that makes up for the want of very many things. Only, alas, her wings are so very soon broken, poor thing, and then she is of no use to us at all. It is time for you all to go to bed, children, said Dorothea, looking up from her spinning. Father is very late tonight. You must not sit up for him. Oh, 5 minutes more, dear Dorothea, they pleaded, and the little rosy and golden Ermengarde climbed up into her lap. Hirschvogel is so warm. The beds are never so warm as he. Cannot you tell us another tale, August? No, cried August, whose face had lost its light now that his story had come to an end, and who sat serious with his hands clasped on his knees, gazing on the luminous arabesques of the stove. That's the curly decorations around the edges. It is only a week to Christmas, he said suddenly. Grandmother's big cakes, chuckled little Christoph, who was 5 years old and thought Christmas meant a big cake and nothing else. What will Santa Claus find for Gilda if she be good? Murmured Dorothea over the child's sunny head. Ermengarde, Gilda. For however hard poverty might pinch, it could never pinch so tightly that Dorothea would not find some wooden toy and some rosy apples to put in her little sister's socks. Father Max has promised me a big goose because I saved the calf's life in June, said Auguste. It was the 20th time he had told them so that month. He was so proud of it. And Aunt Mila will be sure to send us wine and honey and a barrel of flour. She always does, said Albrecht. Their Aunt Mila had a chalet and a little farm over on the green slopes towards Dorp Ampas. I shall go up into the woods and get Hirschvogel's crown, said Auguste. They always crowned Hirschvogel for Christmas, with pine boughs and ivy and mountain berries. The heat soon withered the crown, but it was part of the religion of the day to them, as much so as it was to cross themselves in church and raise their voices in the Salutarius Hostia. That's a particular Latin song that they sing, obviously. And they fell chatting of all they would do on the Christ night, and one little voice piped loud against another, and they were as happy as though their stockings would be full of golden purses and jewelled toys, and the big goose and the soup pot seemed to them such a meal as kings would envy. And that's the end of chapter 3. A little bit of dread starting to creep in. This is a very, very beautifully painted story picture for us. I'm wondering if something is going to go wrong, just because there's more of the story left to go. We'll find out, shall we? But I'm going to have another drink of water, and you probably should too. Sorry, I've got a little bit of hair fell out and it's tickling me. Can't blame the cat this time. We'll carry on. Right, The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida, Chapter 4. In the midst of their chatter and laughter, a blast of frozen air and a spray of driven snow struck like ice through the room and reached them even in the warmth of the old wolf skins and the great stove. It was the door which had opened and let in the cold. It was their father who had come home. The younger children ran joyous to meet him. Dorothea pushed the one wooden armchair of the room to the stove, and Auguste flew to set the jug of beer on a little round table and fill a long clay pipe. For their father was good to them all, and seldom raised his voice in anger, and they had been trained by the mother they had loved to dutifulness. And obedience and a watchful affection. Tonight Karl Streller responded very wearily to the young one's welcome and came to the wooden chair with a tired step and sat down heavily, not noticing either pipe or beer. "Are you not well, dear father?" his daughter asked him. "I am well enough," he answered dully, and sat there with his head bent, letting the lighted pipe grow cold. He was a fair, tall man, grey before his time, and bowed with labour. "Take the children to bed," he said suddenly at last, and Dorothea obeyed. Auguste stayed behind, curled before the stove. At 9 years old, and when one earns money in the summer from the farmers, one is not altogether a child any more, at least in one's own estimation. Auguste did not heed his father's silence. He was used to it. Karl Streller was a man of few words, and being of weakly health, not great health, was usually too tired at the end of the day to do more than drink his beer and sleep. Auguste lay on the wolfskin, dreamy and comfortable, looking up through his drooping eyelids at the golden coronets on the crest of the great stove, and wondering for the millionth time whom it had been made for, and what grand places and scenes it had known. Dorothea came down from putting the little ones in their beds, and the cuckoo clock in the corner struck 8. She looked to her father and the untouched pipe, then sat down to her spinning, saying nothing. She thought he had been drinking in some tavern. It had been often so with him of late. Sounds like he's worried about something. There was a long silence. The cuckoo called the quarter twice. Cuckoo of the clock. August dropped asleep, his curls falling over his face. Dorothea's wheel hummed like a cat. Suddenly, Karl Streller struck his hand on the table, sending the pipe on the ground. "I have sold Hirschvogel," he said, and his voice was husky and ashamed in his throat. The spinning wheel stopped. August sprang erect out of his sleep. Sold Hirschvogel? If their father had dashed the holy crucifix on the floor at their feet and spat upon it, they could not have shuddered under the horror of a greater blasphemy. "I have sold Hirschvogel," said Karl Streller in the same husky, dogged voice. "I have sold it to a travelling trader of such things for 200 florins. What would you? I owe double that." "He saw it this morning when you were all out. He will pack it and take it to Munich tomorrow." Dorothea gave a low, shrill cry. "Oh, father, the children, in midwinter!" She turned white as the snow without. Her words died away in her throat. August stood, half blind with sleep, staring with dazed eyes as his cattle stared at the sun when they came out from their winter's prison. "It is not true, it is not true," he muttered. "You are jesting, father?" Streller broke into a dreary laugh. "It is true. Would you like to know what is true too? That the bread you eat and the meat you put in this pot and the roof you have over your heads are none of them paid for. Have been none of them paid for months and months. If it had not been for your grandfather, I should have been in prison all summer and autumn, and he is out of patience and will do no more now. There is no work to be had. The masters go to younger men. They say I work ill. It may be so. Who can keep his head above water with 10 hungry children dragging him down? When your mother lived, it was different. Boy, you stare at me as if I were a mad dog. You have made a god of yon China thing. Well, it goes tomorrow. 200 florins, that is something. It will keep me out of prison for a little, and with the spring things may turn." August stood like a creature paralyzed. His eyes were wide open, fastened on his father's with terror and incredulous horror. His face had grown as white as his sister's. His chest heaved with tearless sobs. "It is not true, it is not true," he echoed stupidly. It seemed to him that the very skies must fall and the earth perish if they could take away Hirschvogel. They might as soon talk of tearing down God's Son out of the heavens. "You will find it true," said his father, doggedly, and angered because he was in his own soul bitterly ashamed to have bartered away their heirloom, the heirloom and treasure of his race and the comfort and health giver of his young children. "You will find it true. The dealer has paid me half the money tonight and will pay me the other half tomorrow when he packs it up and takes it away to Munich. No doubt it is worth a great deal more, at least I suppose so, as he gives that, but beggars cannot be choosers. The little black stove in the kitchen will warm you all just as well. Who would keep a gilded painted thing in a poor house like this when one can make 200 florins by it? Dorothea, you never sobbed more when your mother died. What is it when all is said? A bit of hardware, much too grand-looking for such a room as this. If all the Strellers had not been born fools, it would have been sold a century ago when it was dug up out of the ground. It is a stove for a museum, the trader said when he saw it. To a museum let it go." August gave a shrill shriek like a hare's when it is caught for its death, and threw himself on his knees at his father's feet. "Oh, father, father," he cried convulsively, his hands closing on Streller's knees and his uplifted face blanched and distorted with terror. "Oh, father, dear father, you cannot mean what you say. Send it away, our life, our son, our joy, our comfort." We shall all die in the dark and cold. Sell me, father. Sell me on to any trade or any pain you like. I will not mind. But Hirschvogel, it is like selling the very cross off the altar. You must be in jest. You could not do such a thing. You could not. You who have always been gentle and good and who have sat in the warmth here, year after year, with our mother. It is not a piece of hardware, as you say. It is a living thing. For a great man's thoughts and fancies have put life into it, and it loves us though we are only poor little children. And we love it with all our hearts and souls, and up in heaven I am sure the dead Hirschvogel knows. Oh, listen, I will go and try and get work tomorrow. I will ask them to let me cut ice or make paths through the snow. There must be something I could do. And I will beg the people we owe money to wait. They are all neighbours, they will be patient, but sell Hirschvogel, oh, never, never, never. Give the florins back to the vile man. Tell him it would be like selling the shroud out of mother's coffin, or the golden curls off Ermengilda's head. Oh, father, dear father, do hear me, for pity's sake. Strella was moved by his boy's anguish. He loved his children, though he was often weary of them, and their pain was pain to him. But besides emotion, and stronger than emotion, was the anger that August roused in him. He hated and despised himself for the barter of the heirloom of his race, and every word of the child stung him with a stinging sense of shame. And he spoke in his wrath rather than in his sorrow. "You're a little fool," he said harshly, as they had never heard him speak. "You rave like a play actor. Get up and go to bed. The stove is sold. There is no more to be said. Children like you have nothing to do with such matters. The stove is sold and goes to Munich tomorrow. What is it to you? Be thankful I can get bread for you. Get on your legs, I say, and go to bed." Strella took up the jug of ale as he paused and drained it slowly, as a man who had no cares. August sprang to his feet and threw his hair back off his face. The blood rushed into his cheeks, making them scarlet. His great soft eyes flamed alight with furious passion. "You dare not," he cried aloud. "You dare not sell it, I say. It is not yours alone, it is ours." Strella flung the emptied jug on the bricks with a force that shivered it to atoms, and rising to his feet, struck his son a blow that felled him to the floor. It was the first time in all his life that he had ever raised his hand against any one of his children. Then he took the oil lamp that stood at his elbow and stumbled off to his own chamber with a cloud before his eyes. "What has happened?" said August a little while later, as he opened his eyes and saw Dorothea weeping above him on the wolfskin before the stove. He had been struck backward, and his head had fallen on the hard bricks, where the wolfskin did not reach. He sat up a moment with his face bent upon his hands. "I remember now," he said, very low under his breath. Dorothea showered him with kisses, while her tears fell like rain. "But, oh dear, how could you speak so to father?" she murmured. "It was very wrong." "No, I was right," said August, and his little mouth, that hitherto had only curled in laughter, curved downward with a fixed and bitter seriousness. "How dare he? How dare he?" he muttered, with his head sunk in his hands. "It is not his alone. It belongs to us all. It is as much yours and mine as his." Dorothea could only sob in answer. She was too frightened to speak. The authority of their parents in the house had never, in her remembrance, been questioned. "Are you hurt by the fall, dear August?" she murmured at length, for he looked to her so pale and strange. "Yes. No, I do not know. What does it matter?" He sat up upon the wolfskin with passionate pain upon his face. All his soul was in rebellion, and he was only a child, and was powerless. "It is a sin, it is a theft, it is an infamy," he said slowly, his eyes fastened on the gilded feet of Hirschvogel. "Oh, August, do not say such things of father," sobbed his sister. "Whatever he does, We ought to think it right. And I'm going to show you a picture. There's August sitting in front of Hirschvogel and his sister checking to see that he's all right. He's saying, I don't know, it's a little hard for you to see. August's here, his sister's here, and there's Hirschvogel, the stove. Is a little hard to see. I really wish I could have the pictures ready for you to see properly. I'm going to have to figure out how to do that. It's beyond me at the moment when I'm reading, but I'll figure out a way to do it. And then you'll be able to see them. That will be good, won't it? Whatever he does, we ought to think it is right, said his sister. August laughed aloud. Is it right that he should spend his money in drink, that he should let others lie unexecuted? I'm not sure. That he should do his work so ill that no one cares to employ him, that he should live on grandfather's charity and then dare to sell a thing that is ours every whit as much as it is his, to sell Hirschvogel. Oh, dear God, I would sooner sell my soul. August, cried Dorothea with piteous entreaty. He terrified her. She could not recognize her little, gay, gentle brother in those fierce and blasphemous words. August laughed aloud again. Then all at once his laughter broke down into bitterest weeping. He threw himself forward on the stove, covering it with kisses and sobbing as though his heart would burst from his bosom. Obviously it's warm, not hot. What could he do? Nothing, nothing, nothing. August, dear August, whispered Dorothea piteously and trembling all over, for she was a very gentle girl and fierce feeling terrified her. August, do not lie there. Come to bed. It is quite late. In the morning you will be calmer. It is horrible indeed, and we shall die of cold, at least the little ones. But if it be father's will... Let me alone, said August, through his teeth, striving to still the storm of sobs that shook him from head to foot. Let me alone. In the morning. How can you speak of the morning? Come to bed, dear, sighed his sister. Oh, August, do not lie and look like that. Lie down and look like that. You frighten me. Do come to bed. I shall stay here. Here? All night? They might take it in the night. Besides, to leave it now... But it is cold. The fire is out. There you go. That's why he was able to kiss it. It will never be warm any more, nor shall we. All his childhood had gone out of him. All his gleeful, careless, sunny temper had gone with it. He spoke sullenly and wearily, choking down the great sobs in his chest. To him it was as if the end of the world had come. His sister lingered by him while striving to persuade him to go to his place in the little crowded bedchamber with Albrecht and Waldo and Christoph, but it was in vain. I shall stay here, was all he answered her. And he stayed all the night long. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm not going to leave you there, I'm sorry. That would be a little bit mean, wouldn't it? We'll see what happens next, shall we? After we've had a drink and refreshed ourselves. Now, my family would say, and here's where the story really begins. In other words, here's where it starts to get interesting. Instead of just all the intro, all the lead up. I will see if I can find a way to show you the pictures. One that works well. That will be interesting. We'll see. Right. Chapter 5. The lamps went out. The rats came... I'll do it the way I do properly. I'm Jev, and we are reading The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 5. The lamps went out, because it was night time. The rats came and ran across the floor. As the hours crept on through midnight and past, the cold intensified and the air of the room grew like ice. August did not move. He lay with his face downward on the golden and rainbow-hued pedestal of the household treasure, which henceforth was to be cold for evermore, an exiled thing in a foreign city, in a far-off land. Whilst yet it was dark, his 3 elder brothers came down the stairs and let themselves out, each bearing his lantern and going to his work in the stone yard and timber yard and at the salt works. They did not notice him. They did not know what had happened. A little later his sister came down with a light in her hand to make ready the house ere morning should break. She stole up to him and laid her hand on his shoulder timidly. "Dear August, you must be frozen. August, do look up, do speak." August raised his eyes with a wild, feverish, sullen look in them that she had never seen there. His face was ashen white, his lips were like fire. He had not slept all night, but his passionate sobs had given way to delirious waking dreams and numb, senseless trances, which had alternated one on another all through the freezing, lonely, horrible hours. "It will never be warm again," he muttered, "never again." Dorothea clasped him with trembling hands. "August, August, do you not know me?" she cried in an agony. "I am Dorothea. Wake up, dear, wake up. It is the morning, only so dark." August shuddered all over. "The morning," he echoed. He slowly rose up onto his feet. "I will go to grandfather," he said, very low. "He is always good. Perhaps he could save it." Loud blows with the heavy iron knocker of the house door drowned his words. A strange voice called aloud through the keyhole. "Let me in, quick! There is no time to lose. More snow like this and the roads will all be blocked. Let me in, do you hear? I'm come to take the great stove." August sprang erect, his fists doubled, his eyes blazing. "You shall never touch it," he screamed. "You shall never touch it." "Who shall prevent us?" laughed a big man who was a Bavarian, amused at the fierce little figure fronting him. "I," said August. "You shall never have it. You shall kill me first." "Strella," said the big man as August's father entered the room, "you have got a little mad dog here. Muzzle him." One way and another they did muzzle him. He fought like a little demon and hit out right and left, and one of his blows gave the Bavarian a black eye. But he was soon mastered by 4 grown men, and his father flung him with no light hand out from the door of the back entrance, and the buyers of the stately and beautiful stove set to work to pack it heedfully and carry it away. I'm sorry, I have to itch my eye. Oh dear, what's going to happen now? When Dorothea stole out to look for August, he was nowhere in sight. She went back to little Gilda, who was ailing and sobbing and sobbed. Little Gilda, who was ailing and sobbed over the child, whilst the others stood looking on, dimly understanding that with Hirschvogel was going all the warmth of their bodies, all the light of their hearth. Even their father was now sorry and ashamed, but 200 florins seemed a big sum to him, and after all, he thought, the children could warm themselves quite as well at the black iron stove in the kitchen. Besides, whether he regretted it now or not, the work of the Nürnberg potter was sold irrevocably, and he had to stand still and see the men from Munich wrap it in manifold wrappings and bear it out into the snowy air to where an ox cart stood in waiting for it. In another moment, Hirschvogel was gone, gone forever and forever and always. August had stood still for a long time, leaning sick and faint from the violence that had been used to him against the back wall of the house. So this is what was happening in the meantime. The wall looked on a court where a well was, and the backs of other houses, and beyond them the spire of the Munz tower, and the peaks of the mountains. Into the court an old neighbour hobbled for water, and seeing the boy said to him, "Child, is it true your father is selling the big painted stove?" August nodded his head and then burst into a passion of tears. "Well, for sure he is a fool," said the neighbour. Heaven forgive me for calling him so before his own child, but the stove was worth a mint of money. I do remember in my young days, in old Anton's time, that was your great-grandfather, my lad. A stranger from Vienna saw it, and said it was worth its weight in gold. August's sobs went on their broken, impetuous course. I loved it. I loved it, he moaned. I did not care what its value was. I loved it. I loved it. You little simpleton, said the old man kindly, but you are wiser than your father when all's said. If sell it he must, he should have taken it to good Herr Steiner over at Spruce, who would have given him honest value, but no doubt they took him over his beer. Aye, but if I were you, I would do better than cry. I would go after it. August raised his head, the tears raining down his cheeks. Go after it when you are bigger, said the neighbour, with a good-natured wish to cheer him up a little. The world is a small thing, after all. I was a travelling clockmaker once upon a time, and I know that your stove will be safe enough, whoever gets it. Anything that can be sold for a round sum is always wrapped up in cotton wool by everybody. Aye, don't cry so much. You will see your stove again some day. Sorry. Then the old man hobbled away to draw his brazen pail full of water at the well. August remained leaning against the wall. His head was buzzing and his heart fluttering with the new idea which had presented itself to his mind. Go after it, had said the old man. He thought, why not go with it? He loved it better than anyone, even better than Dorothea. And he shrank from the thought of meeting his father again. His father, who had sold Hirschvogel. He was by this time in that state of exaltation in which the impossible looks quite natural and commonplace. His tears were still wet on his pale cheeks, but they had ceased to fall. He ran out of the courtyard by a little gate and across to the huge Gothic porch of the church. From there he could watch unseen his father's house door, at which were always hanging some blue and grey pictures, such as are common and so picturesque in Austria. For a part of the house was let to a man who dealt in pottery. Interesting description. I'm going to have to look up these blue and grey jugs. He hid himself in the grand portico where he had so often passed through to go to mass or compline within, and presently his heart gave a great leap, for he saw the straw-enveloped stove brought out and laid with infinite care on the bullock dray. Two of the Bavarian men mounted beside it, and the sleigh wagon slowly crept over the snow of the place, snow crisp and hard as stone. The noble old minster looked its grandest and most solemn. This is the church building, the minster. Looked its grandest and most solemn, with its dark grey stone and its vast archways, and its porch that was itself as big as many a church, and its strange gargoyles and lamp irons black against the snow on its roof and on the pavement. But for once August had no eyes for it. He only watched for his old friend. Then he, a little unnoticeable figure enough, like a score of other boys in hall, crept unseen by any of his brothers or sisters out of the porch and over the shelving uneven square, and followed in the wake of the dray. Interesting. I wonder where he's going. We'll find out. Its course lay towards the station of the railway, which is close to the salt works, whose smoke at times sullies this part of clean little Hall, though it does not do very much damage. From Hall the iron road runs northward through glorious country to Salzburg, Vienna, Prague, Ouida, and southward over the Brenner into Italy. Was Hirschvogel going north or south? This, at least, he would soon know. And that's the end of that chapter. Yes, I'm going to read one more. One more mouthful. Yes, there is some in there. And then this will be the last chapter for today. Okay? I have to come back next time for the next one. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida, Chapter 6. August had often hung about the little station watching the trains come and go and dive into the heart of the hills and vanish. No one said anything to him for idling about. People are kind-hearted and easy of temper in this pleasant land. That's what happens when you've got a reasonably small community. Most of the time people are just not really too much rock the boat sort of thing. They know one another, so if you have a bad attitude, that comes across to everybody and everybody knows it about you, and so therefore, unless you really don't care, people can be a little bit more kind and considerate and things like that. Not always, it's not guaranteed, but that's not too unusual in small places. Anyway, people are kind-hearted and easy of temper in this pleasant land, and children and dogs are both happy there. He heard the Bavarians arguing and vociferating a great deal, and learned that they meant to go too, and wanted to go with the great stove itself. But this they could not do, for neither could the stove go by a passenger train, nor they themselves go in a goods train. So at length they insured their precious burden for a large sum, and consented to send it by a luggage train, which was to pass through Hall in half an hour. The swift trains seldom deigned to notice the existence of Hall at all. August heard, and a desperate resolve made itself up in his little mind. Where Hirschvogel went, would he go. He gave one terrible thought to Dorothea, poor gentle Dorothea, sitting in the cold at home, then set to work to execute his project. How he managed it, he never knew very clearly himself, but certain it is that when the goods train from the north had come all the way from Linz on the Danube, moved out of Hall, August was hidden behind the stove in the great covered truck, and wedged unseen and undreamt of by any human creature amidst the cases of wood carving, of clocks and clockwork, of Vienna toys, of Turkish carpets, of Russian skins, of Hungarian wines, which shared the same abode as did his swathed and bound Hirschvogel. No doubt he was very naughty, but it never occurred to him that he was so. His whole mind and soul were absorbed in the one entrancing idea, to follow his beloved friend and fire king. It was very dark in the closed truck, which had only a little window above the door, and it was crowded and had a strong smell in it from the Russian hides and the hams that were in it. But August was not frightened. He was close to Hirschvogel, and presently he meant to be closer still, for he meant to do nothing less than get inside Hirschvogel itself. Being a shrewd little boy and having had, by great luck, 2 silver groschen in his breeches pocket, so that's a smaller value coin, obviously, to a florin, in his breeches pocket, which he had earned the day before by chopping wood, he had bought some bread and sausage at the station of a woman who knew him, so he'd bought them from, weird English usage, and who thought he was going out to his uncle Joachim's cabinet. Of a woman there who knew him, and who thought he was going out to his uncle Joachim's chalet above Jenbach. This he had with him, the bread and sausage, and this he ate in the darkness, and the lumbering, pounding, thundering noise which made him giddy, as never had he been in a train of any kind before. So he was surrounded by this noise, which was very new to him. Still he ate, having had no breakfast, and being a child, and half a German, and not knowing at all how or when he ever would eat again. When he had eaten, not as much as he wanted, but as much as he thought was prudent, for who could say when he would be able to buy anything more, he set to work like a little mouse to make a hole in the withers of straw and hay which enveloped the stove. If it had been put in a packing case, he would have been defeated at the onset. As it was, he gnawed and nibbled and pulled and pushed, just as a mouse would have done, making his hole where he guessed that the opening of the stove was. the opening through which he had so often thrust the big oak logs to feed it. No one disturbed him. The heavy train went lumbering on, and he saw nothing at all of the beautiful mountains and shining waters and great forests through which he was being carried. He was hard at work getting through the straw and hay and twisted ropes, and get through them at last he did, and found the door of the stove, which he knew so well, and which was quite large enough for a child of his age to slip through, and it was this which he had counted upon doing. Because the stove's cold, remember. They obviously cleaned out the ashes. Otherwise, it would be a bit of a mess carrying it around, so that's been dealt with anyway. They've probably cleaned it. Slip through he did, as he had often done at home for fun. Oh, there you go. So he knew about the possibility. And curled himself up there to see if he could anyhow remain during many hours. He found that he could. Air came in through the brass fretwork of the stove. So these are the air vents of the stove itself. And with admirable caution in such a little fellow, he leaned out, drew the hay and straw together, and rearranged the ropes so that no one could ever have dreamed a little mouse had been at them. Then he curled himself up again, this time more like a dormouse than anything else, and being safe inside his dear Hirschvogel, and intensely cold, he went fast asleep as if he were in his own bed at home with Albrecht and Christoph on either side of him. The train lumbered on, stopping often and long, as the habit of goods trains is, sweeping the snow away with its cow switcher, and rumbling through the deep heart of the mountains, with its lamps aglow like the eyes of a dog in a night of frost. The train rolled on in its heavy, slow fashion, and the child slept soundly for a long while. When he did awake, it was quite dark outside in the land. He could not see, and of course he was in absolute darkness, and for a while he was sorely frightened, and trembled terribly, and sobbed in a quiet, heartbroken fashion, thinking of them all at home. Poor Dorothea! How anxious she would be! How she would run over the town and walk up to grandfather's at Dorf Ampas, and perhaps even send over to Jenbach, thinking he had taken refuge with Uncle Joachim. His conscience smote him for the sorrow he must be even then causing to his gentle sister. But it never occurred to him to try and go back. If he once were to lose sight of Hirschvogel, how could he ever hope to find it again? How could he ever know whether it had gone north, south, east, or west? The old neighbour had said that the world was small, but August knew at least that it must have a great many places in it. That he had seen himself on maps on his schoolhouse walls. Almost any other little boy would, I think, have been frightened out of his wits at the position in which he found himself, but August was brave. And he had a firm belief that God himself and Hirschvogel would take care of him. The master potter of Nürnberg was always present to his mind, a kindly, benign, and gracious spirit, dwelling manifestly in that porcelain tower whereof he had been the maker. A droll fancy, you say, but every child with a soul in him has quite as quaint fancies as this one was of August's. So he got over his terror and his sobbing both, though he was so utterly in the dark. He did not feel cramped at all, because the stove was so large, and air he had in plenty as it came through the fretwork running around the top. He was hungry again, and again nibbled with prudence at his loaf and his sausage. He could not at all tell the hour. Every time the train stopped and he heard the banging, stamping, shouting and jangling of chains that went on, his heart seemed to jump up into his mouth. If they should find him out! Perhaps sometimes porters came and took away this case and the other, a sack here, a bale there, now a big bag, and now a dead chamois, that's a deer, certain sort, that the leather is from. Every time the men trampled near him and swore at each other and banged this and that to and fro, he was so frightened that his very breath seemed to stop. When they came to lift the stove out, would they find him? And if they did find him, would they kill him? That was what he kept thinking of all the way, all through the dark hours which seemed without end. The goods trains are usually very slow and are many days doing what a quick train does in a few hours. This one was quicker than most because it was bearing goods to the King of Bavaria. Still, it took all the short winter's day and the long winter's night and half another day to go over ground that the mail trains cover in a forenoon. It passed great armoured Kufstein, standing across the beautiful and solemn gorge. I'm guessing that's a castle. It passed It passed great armoured Kufstein, standing across the beautiful and solemn gorge, denying the right of way to all the foes of Austria. It passed 12 hours later, after lying by in an out-of-the-way station, in out-of-the-way stations, pretty Rosenheim, that marks the border of Bavaria. And here the Nürnberg stove, with August inside it, was lifted out heedfully and set under a covered way. When it was lifted out, the boy had hard work to keep in his screams. He was tossed to and fro as the men lifted the huge thing, and the earthenware walls of his beloved Fire King were not cushions of down. However, though they swore and grumbled at the weight of it, they never suspected that a living child was inside it, and they carried it out onto the platform and set it down under the roof of the goods shed. There it passed the rest of the night and all the next morning, and August was all the while within it. And that's the end of that chapter, and I'm stopping there for today's reading. Oh my goodness, would you have thought to do that if they were taking away your beloved stove, your beloved Hirschvogel? Would you have climbed inside it and hidden there? Would you have thought enough beforehand to get yourself some bread and some dried sausage to be able to eat along the way, and then not eat all of it at once when you were hungry, but to eat some of it and then go to sleep and then just keep lying there? Have you ever tried lying somewhere in the dark when you can't sleep and thought about how long it takes for all that time to go past? That must have been such an experience for him, that poor lad. Oh my goodness. Wow. That's just extreme. Let's see what happens next time, shall we? Don't forget to come back and find out the next part of the story. I want to know what happens next. Goodness me. I hope you do too, by the way. Thank you for being here and listening. I do enjoy having you here listening to the story. It's nice to read stories to people. I'm just going to give you my link to my YouTube channel for those who weren't here earlier on when I posted it. Over there you will find other stories that I've read, and eventually this story. The reason I say over there is because I'm currently reading this on Twitch, which is a broadcasting service for videos, game playing mainly, but other things as well, where it's done live. And so what happens is I read on Twitch. The story that I have read is available for 2 weeks after I've read it, and then it is removed. And in the meantime, I get it all ready. I take away the extra bits on the picture, so you just have this bit here, and me talking, and the sound of my voice. And I load it up on YouTube and put it into a playlist with all of the other videos from the book. And then eventually, roughly 2 weeks after I've read it, on Twitch, it becomes available on YouTube. And so that's why I give you the link to my channel over on YouTube. So if you want to listen to any other stories, you can go and listen to them there. And there's all sorts. There's Millie Molly Mandy stories, there's The Wind in the Willows, there's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Those two are in one playlist. But all of the others, apart from Millie Molly Mandy, all the Millie Molly Mandy stories are in one playlist because there's so many of them and they're all very, very short little ones. All of the other books, we have one book per playlist. Even the books where there are sequels, where there are a series of 3 books, I label them in such a way that you know that they are sequels to each other, but each playlist is one book. So what you can do is you can start a playlist and listen to as much as you want, and then you can continue the rest of it another time. So if you miss this here on Twitch, you will be able to hear the rest of it on YouTube. If you missed the beginning, you will be able to catch up with that on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, congratulations, you've already found me. And I'll see you next time. I look forward to finding out what happens to Hirschvogel and what's his name? Go on, tell me, what's the little boy's name? August. Do you? We'll see you then. Bye.